course, you don't have to look very far on the internet or anywhere else to find voices of unbelief, such as Bart Ehrman. The Bible's a false idol. Or remember the Da Vinci Code? Everything our fathers taught us about Christ is wrong, the Da Vinci Code said. Do you think that the Bible stories of Jesus are true? Well, that's what those authorities, that's what those authors, the scholars said. I wonder what the people on the street would say. So someone, not us, but someone went down on the Nicollet Mall, downtown, one afternoon, with a roving microphone and camera, and recorded what people said in response to that question. Do you think the Bible stories of Jesus are true? Listen to what they had to say.
I don't know. I don't read the Bible.
A lot of it's stories, but it's parables to help us learn. Aspects of the Bible are definitely historically reliable.
People can make it the truth, and people, based on what they believe, can make that happen for them.
It's true as much as you want it to be. It depends on who you are and what works for your situation.
Who's to say how true it is and how untrue it is?
I think it's a historical document. But some of the things in there you're going to have to take with a grain of salt and believe whatever you choose to believe.
I think it's been interpreted and reinterpreted and sometimes rewritten the way people want to read it.
I don't think it's a historical document in the sense that it can be used literally or should be interpreted literally. I would guess it has a lot to do with stories that have been embellished or changed.
Yeah, I believe that it was a fictitious story that came about around a campfire one night, and then you got the Bible. Everybody relies on it, but who knows if it's true.
A lot of people debate about whether it's historically accurate or not, and I don't even know if that's a valid point. At least for me, it's not.
Oh yeah, sure. There's something historical about it. Yeah. Essentially it's historical. But the question is, so what?
There's no historical evidence. How could it have disappeared if this actually had happened? Wouldn't God have wanted there to be evidence?
There may be some confusion about this issue. Yeah, they're all over the map. And we're in an area where there seems to be quite a bit of exposure to Christianity. But they're still extremely confused. Let me summarize some of the things they said. The stories of Jesus are fiction. The stories of Jesus have been changed over the years. There's no historical evidence for the stories of Jesus. Let's take a look at those and see if we can provide an answer to those questions to what these people said. In order to do so, we're going to have to look at what we call manuscripts of ancient works, like the New Testament, like Aristotle, like the historian Josephus. All kinds of people wrote in ancient times. And what we know about their writings comes through handwritten manuscripts, because remember, there's no printing press until the 15th century. So everything from ancient times is all the result of hand copy, and they're therefore called manuscripts. Here's a book. Would you believe this book was written by the emperor of the Roman Empire called Julius Caesar, 50 years before Jesus ever came? It is awfully good shape for being that old, isn't it? How do you get a paperback like this of something that the emperor of the Roman Empire 50 years before Christ would have written at that time? Well, that's an issue that we have to understand in order for us to proceed. There's a timeline. Got the arrow pointing to 50 years before Christ, before zero time. You see the printing press? Way down in the 15th century. So this has got to be copied for 1,450 years by hand before it can ever be printed. What could happen when they do that? They make mistakes. We all know that, don't we? We copy, we leave out a word, we skip a whole sentence. All kinds of things could happen when the scribes, that's who's going to do this, scribal copying, a profession. During all that time, there was a profession called scribism. And that's what they did for a living. Made handwritten copies of documents. There's an example. of an ancient document. I'm going to put this right out here. You can send it around back and then come back around that side. What this is, leave it in the plastic, but you can get it and touch it and stuff here on the top. This is called papyrus. This is from Egypt, and this is the kind of material that the 1st and 2nd century manuscripts are written on when we find them in dumps and around archaeological digs and stuff like that. You can see, you'll be able to notice when it comes to you that it's rather coarse, and it's made from a reed along the Nile River. But that's what this is. What you're seeing there is a page from the Gospel of John written on papyrus. It can rot, it can burn, it can tear. The stories of Jesus are fiction. Let's take a look at that. Why not this? Why not anything that comes from ancient times? How would a scholar know whether it's fiction or whether it's real? We need to look at that for manuscripts. One of the things we need to understand about manuscripts is that the best way to find out if this book is exactly what Julius Caesar wrote is go back and compare it to his original. It should be perfect, shouldn't it? What's the problem? Don't have any original. We don't have any originals not only of this book, we don't have any originals of any ancient writings. We don't have Aristotle's originals. We don't have Josephus, we don't have Tacitus, we don't have Plato. We don't have the Old Testament. We don't have the New Testament. We don't have the Quran. We don't have any of them. Well then, what are we reading? Scholars, as manuscripts are found from later centuries, copies have been made. And as they find these, they collect them. It might only be a page. It might only be a chapter. It might only be a few verses because of rotting and burning and tearing and everything like that. So they have to take all these pieces, these partials, and everything else they can find for this. And then they pore over them and try to piece it back together from the manuscript copies. And what you're reading here is a reconstruction based on later scribal manuscripts, not based on Julius Caesar's original. The same thing with other ancient writings as well, including the New Testament. And why do we trust it? Let's look. This is a timeline which shows Jesus' death and resurrection over here about 30 AD. People at that time would have been aware of Jesus and knew him, especially those who traveled around with him and so forth. But we call up to about 100 AD the eyewitness period, because by 100 AD, probably everybody is dead who knew Jesus. The Christian claim is that the 27 books of the New Testament were all written in the eyewitness time period. Why does that matter? Well, when you realize that there are lots of things written about Jesus not in the eyewitness generation. They're called legends. Volumes and volumes and volumes. For example, Nag Hammadi, down in Egypt, in 1945 they found volumes such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of the Egyptians, the Apocryphon of John, the Apocalypse of Peter. There are others as well. The problem is they weren't written in the eyewitness generation. They were written in the red zone in the 2nd or 3rd century. What happens when you're in the red zone? Well, Thomas wasn't alive anymore. Thomas has been dead for over 100 years. Then why is it the Gospel of Thomas? Because whoever wrote it in the late 2nd century wanted to give it credibility. And the only way it could get credibility is if you'd put somebody's name on it who was with Jesus. Then they should know what they're talking about because they were there. They're called pseudepigrapha. Pseudo is false, ascription to someone, falsely ascribed to someone. The Gospel of Judas, heard of it? The Gospel of Philip. All kinds of other Gospels have been found. Why didn't they get into the New Testament? Well, the primary reason is because they were not eyewitnesses. You can't trust them. You know, after 100 years, the stories get rather elaborate. Let me give you an example of what happens when you start trusting these 2nd and 3rd century writings about Jesus. I'm looking at the Gospel of Thomas. I'm looking at the infancy Gospels. Have you ever wondered what Jesus was really like? You know, we have him born in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. We have him at 12 years old. And we have him when he starts his ministry at 30. We don't know what he was like as a teenager. We don't know what he was like as an elementary student. None of that's in there. You'd like to know? Go to the 2nd and 3rd century writings. They fill it all in for you. For example, now his father was a carpenter and made at that time plows and yokes. And there was required of him a bed by a certain rich man, that he should make it for him. And whereas one beam, that which is called the shifting one, was too short, and Joseph didn't know what to do. The young child, Jesus, said to his father, Joseph, lay down the 2 pieces of wood and make them even at the end next to you. And Joseph did as the young child said to him. And Jesus stood at the other end and took a hold of the shorter beam and stretched it and made it equal with the other. And his father Joseph saw it and marveled, and he embraced the young child and kissed him, saying, happy am I that God gave me this young child. You see, in these writings of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, Jesus is equivalent to a sideshow in a circus. The little kid touches anything, and it turns into a miracle. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John have Jesus doing absolutely 0 miracles until he begins his ministry at age 30. But everybody has a curiosity, and so they just made up things. That's what you get when you don't have eyewitnesses. You get fish stories, right? Or what about this? Simon Peter said to Jesus, let Mary, talking about Mary Magdalene, not Mary the mother of Jesus, let Mary Magdalene leave us, for women are not worthy of life. Now this is the Gospel of Thomas, claiming that this is a statement and saying of Jesus. One group, the Jesus Seminar group, has incorporated the Gospel of Thomas into the Bible. They have 5 Gospels when they published it, not 4. Let's finish. Women are not worthy of life. Jesus said, I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit like you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter into the kingdom of heaven. No amens? No hallelujahs or anything? Come on. Oh, yeah. Yes. That's the garbage that they're attributing to Jesus. Because it's written 100 to 200 or 300 years after everybody's dead who knew him. We want to be certain that we have documents that are from the eyewitness generation. Why? Not only would they have the first-hand knowledge of what Jesus said and did, but they have to write it at a time when the enemies are also alive, who are going to be a correction to them, because if they write that Jesus did a miracle in some particular location, somebody's going to come up and say, come on, guys, I was there too. He never ever did that. So there's a correction when you're writing in the eyewitness generation. You can't exaggerate without somebody protesting. What do you get from these then? Infancy gospels that are fanciful. You get heretical philosophies, and you get false teachings attributed to Jesus. I would not trust the authority of any document that did not come from people who were with Jesus himself. So do we have that? Well, let's take a look. Quickly, we'll lay out some of the evidence. John Ryland's fragment is a portion of John's gospel that has been found, and it dates, and no matter who you are, a liberal scholar or a conservative scholar, they're all in agreement in this one, that it's from around AD 125. That's not 160 then, is it? That's earlier than the red zone, but it's still not into the eyewitness generation. But we'll put it there at 120 to 130. Certainly, it was closer to the eyewitness generation. And then there are people called the early apostolic fathers. These are the students of the apostles. These are the Apostle John's students, the Apostle Peter, the Apostle Paul, and so forth. Born too late to have known Jesus themselves. He died before they could have known him. But they knew the people and studied from the people who were with Jesus as eyewitnesses. They wrote these letters, accumulated in here, between about 90 AD, in the first century, on up to like 130 or something like that. What do we find when we see these? For example, Polycarp. He was a student of the Apostle John. Notice the date at the very top. By what date are we looking at his letters? By 110 AD. He quotes or refers to 18 New Testament books, including all four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So what would you have to conclude about those 18 New Testament books then? They must have been written prior to 110. And at this point, Polycarp is quoting from them as if the people he's writing to in the churches already know about it. He doesn't qualify and say, oh, you may not be aware of this, but I have in my hands a writing of my mentor, the Apostle John. No, they all know that. So it must have been written considerably earlier than that. Or what about Ignatius? By the date of 108 in the writings in here, he refers to 24 of the New Testament books, including Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. By the way, how many New Testament books are there? I didn't hear it yet. 27. Ignatius quotes all but 3 of the New Testament books in his communication by 108, meaning 24 out of 27 had to have already been in existence by 108. Clement, by AD 96, in a letter that he wrote to the church, quotes or refers to 11 New Testament books, including the synoptics of Matthew, Mark, and Luke by 96. Once again, which means then that those writings had to have been written before that, because remember, it's hard. You don't have a copy machine. You can't take the work and run off 50 copies and send it out to the churches. You have to hire a scribe. And they have to hand copy it before you can send it out and have it used by people. Therefore, it took more time. Therefore, we'd have to assume that the New Testament books were written well back in the first century in order to have copies of those available and be used and referred to in the letters that they were writing to people. Demonstrates that 25 of the 27 books must have been in circulation at least by AD 95 and written probably considerably earlier. So we have the New Testament quoted by others, which clearly took it completely out of the red zone and put it into the first century eyewitness generation. Finally, and lastly, in regard to the manuscripts, Time magazine, way back in 1996, published an issue with an article in it about manuscripts of the New Testament. And in it pointed out the scholars had recently found 3 manuscripts, one of Matthew, one of Mark, and one of Luke, that are being dated by some scholars earlier than any previous manuscripts ever found. Here's one, the Magdalen Papyrus, part of Matthew 26. Dr. Carson Peter Thiede, the late Dr. Carson Peter Thiede, dated it about 66 AD. We're within 36 years of Jesus' life himself. We already have the story of Jesus in written form. In the 19th century, the story was all they ever did was told the story of Jesus verbally. And they didn't write it down until the end of the 2nd century in the red zone. Then the manuscripts started to come in, And all of a sudden they realized, wait a minute. It was not communicated verbally for generations. They wrote it down in the very first generation. The people who were with Jesus and knew him wrote it down. And that's what they began to find out. A manuscript of Mark now has come up on the internet. You can go to a website and it'll point out to you, this manuscript has been found of the Gospel of Mark. It's already been run around through university scholars, and the consensus is this is a first century portion of the Gospel of Mark. So we put the earliest gospel manuscripts there, around 60 to 70, making it clear that the New Testament writings had to have been written in the first century during the eyewitness time period. And therefore, Peter's statement should have been listened to in the first place. We did not follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. It's only now, in our generation, that the evidence has accumulated to back that statement up and say, Peter, you were speaking truthfully. These were the writings of the eyewitnesses of Jesus. So, the objection one, the stories of Jesus are fiction. True or false? Likely to be false. In a time period that we have tonight and next week, we obviously cannot give a college-length course on those kinds of issues. All I can give you is the indication of where scholarship is at today, and they would tend to agree with that this is the case. They could not be fiction and be able to impact people in the first century as they did, people who were willing to die for the message that they were writing, and therefore not likely to be fiction. I'm going to hurry along here and try to finish these objections. The stories of Jesus were changed over the years. You can understand why now. Because they originated in the first century and they have to be copied for 1,400 years by hand. Why not an eroding away of the accuracy all the way through that time period? Well, let's take a look at that. One of the ways scholars measure whether they're reconstructing the work with confidence is how many manuscripts have been found of the work in question. I think you can understand that if you have one or two manuscripts, could you easily detect if a scribe had made an error, a mistake along the way? No, because you have nothing to compare it with. Because keep in mind, a lot of the manuscripts are partial. They're not whole, they're not complete. There's only a part of it there. So you need a lot of them. The more, the better. If you have hundreds of them, look at all the comparisons you can make. Likely, one of those hundreds has the missing piece that allows you to reconstruct it with accuracy and with confidence. The book we were talking about, Julius Caesar, 251 different manuscripts have been found, from which this book is reconstructed. That's a lot. That's really good. The most manuscripts for any ancient writing is Homer's Iliad, has 1,757 manuscripts. That is a reconstructionist dream. They just go ecstatic to have that many manuscripts. They can reconstruct the work with great confidence when they have so many manuscripts. Well, we didn't put the New Testament up there because there are people who question it. Surely it must not compare it with these very good ones. These are the best that we have from ancient times. Oh, they shrunk. I had to shrink them in order to even put the New Testament bar on the same graph. Over 24,000 manuscripts of the New Testament have been found. The next closest of any literature known to humanity from ancient times is Homer's Iliad with 1,757. Which of those on the screen do you think could be reconstructed with the greatest confidence and the greatest accuracy? The one with the most manuscripts. That's the New Testament. And it's not even close. It's head and shoulders above everything else ever written. Second test scholars will use. How early are they? Remember the timeline? We want to go back to that and say, Julius Caesar wrote it in 50 BC, but we don't have his original. Well, when do we find a copy that survived? Not until 900 AD. All 251 manuscripts that this was reconstructed from are from 900 AD to the printing press. There are none earlier. What if it was changed in 800 AD? Can't know. Don't have any manuscripts from that. What about 600? What about 300? No manuscripts. We have to hope that the manuscripts we found 900 and after still represent what Julius Caesar wrote in 50 BC. No way of knowing that, but we just trust that that's the case. Nobody ever told you that in school, did they? Students, I'm going to give you this to read, but remember, there are 251 manuscripts, but 950 years went by without any manuscript surviving, and we have to trust the ones that are 950 years later. No, they give it to you and say, here, this is what Julius Caesar wrote. Not any questions asked. Aristotle wrote Poetics in the 4th century before Christ. There's not a single manuscript that's ever survived until 1100 AD. 1,400 years of copying and time went by between his authorship and the first surviving manuscript. Is that enough time for some changes that might have crept into the text due to copying? 1,400 years? I think so. But nobody cares. They don't even balk at it. They don't even point it out. But you give somebody the New Testament. You don't trust that, do you? It's been changed over the years. Virgil, the best one you can get from ancient literature is Virgil, wrote Aeneid, and there's about 300 years between the time he wrote and the first surviving manuscript. That's still enough time for somebody to change it, but it's certainly a lot shorter. See, we want to narrow that gap so there's less time for any changes that could creep into the text during the copying process. So there's the range. It goes from about 1,450 years between authorship and the first manuscript down to about 200 is the best you can find. What about the New Testament? Remember we said that we have this timeline, and in the 1st century is when they were written, between 45 and 100 AD. All 27 books of the New Testament were written in that 1st century, between 45 and 100. Where do we find the first manuscripts? In the same century. Is there much time between the authorship and the first manuscripts? No, and they're still within the eyewitness generation. Would they know if somebody made a mistake in copying? Of course. Well, then they changed it later. Some of the other centuries, 1,400 years is a long time. Until you look at the evidence, among the 24,000 manuscripts, they're found in every century, all the way from the first to the printing press. Take any manuscript you want. 3rd century, 6th century, 8th century, 10th century, 12th century. Check it out for yourself. Did they get changed? And the answer is no. We have a continuous record of the New Testament manuscripts all the way from the 1st century to the printing press, to prove that they did not get changed in transmission. The best by far. Let me do one more thing about accuracy. The historic Christian position is that the Bible is without error in the autograph. Now, some of you are probably even been thinking about, is this guy telling us that there is mistakes in the New Testament? Well, you need to understand this really clearly before you leave here, lest I get thrown out. The historic Christian position is the Bible's without error in the autographs. What's that mean? The originals. Do we have those? No, we don't have the originals. So the doctrines of inerrancy in the Christian faith, the doctrine of infallibility applies only to the originals. What we're doing here is comparing the scribes' manuscripts from later centuries. We're not challenging inerrancy or infallibility. We're not even talking about that. We're talking how well they got transmitted and how accurately, without changing them, they got transmitted. The Mahabharata, religious book of Hinduism, when Dr. Bruce Metzger researched this matter, he wanted to find out how much change took place over the centuries of the transmission of these major works. He eliminated spelling differences. He said that doesn't affect anything. That doesn't change the meaning. Word order, he eliminated that. The only thing he counted as changes were those that changed the meaning of a sentence or a paragraph or a text. the Mahabharata, a religious book of Hinduism, and he found that there were 1 out of every 10 lines changed so significantly that they'd have to be considered distortions, and we do not know what should be in those 1 out of every 10 lines. In the case of the Iliad, 1 out of every 20 lines is distorted in transmission so much that the translators cannot be sure what the Iliad should read in 1 out of every 20 lines. Again, the Iliad is read in schools across the nation. I doubt that ever the student is told, watch out, 1 out of every 20 lines is up for grabs. We don't know what he said. They got to the New Testament, only 0.2% of the scribal copies differed enough that he could call it a distortion. Or put it another way, 99.8% of the New Testament has not been altered in any way during the entire transmission process to the printing press that would have distorted the meaning. 0.2% did. In order for you to understand what I'm talking about here, let me give you an example. Anyone here have a Bible? And go to Mark's Gospel, the last chapter, chapter 16. Do you see a bracket or an asterisk or anything to indicate that there might be a footnote? Would you read the footnote? I'm going to just point out the 2 parts you said. The note says some early manuscripts of Mark's Gospel end at verse 8. Verses 9 through 20 are not in the manuscript. My Bible ends in verse 20, but has the footnote also, which points out the discrepancy between manuscripts. That's what I'm talking about. This is an example that's included in the 0.2%. There's so little of the New Testament like this that it makes up such a small portion. But no teaching of the Christian faith is affected by any of the 0.2% scribal distortions in transmission. Christians are honest. They put a note in there and say, well, we have manuscripts that end at verse 8 and manuscripts that end at verse 20. John chapter 7:53 through chapter 8, verse 13, is the story of the woman who was caught by the Jews in adultery, and they were going to stone her to death. There are some manuscripts of John's Gospel that don't include that story in it. It's not there. Which one should we publish? Should we publish the one with it or the one without it? Well, let's put it in and put in a note to caution people. Maybe God never intended that this story should be in this gospel. We can't be sure. Now, why do I say that you shouldn't be too upset with this? First of all, that's the best we have, the manuscript copies. It only affects 0.2% of the New Testament. It affects no teaching or theology of the New Testament in any way. As a Christian, I'm proud to say that we are courageous enough to admit that the scribes didn't do it perfect. Almost, but they didn't do it perfect. And we can live with the minor little differences that do occur in the New Testament, and we're going to be upfront about it. We're going to tell people, don't build your doctrines on those 2 passages. Do it on the 99.8% that you find in the rest of the New Testament. There's some minor ones too. True or false? They didn't change over the centuries. What I'm picking up and reading putting in my hand right now is what the apostles wrote in the 1st century. You can still reject it, but don't use those kinds of excuses. And this is where the Da Vinci Code went wrong. He based all of his teaching in the Da Vinci Code on the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Judas, all fairy tales, all heresies, written 100 to 200 years after everybody was dead who knew Jesus. What did the New Testament do? Based its entire story on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are the only Gospels that has ever been found or ever known or referred to in the 1st century. Everything else is 2nd or 3rd or 4th century. So they stayed with the eyewitnesses and not heresy. Aha! The gospel records in our Bible today are essentially unchanged from what was written by the eyewitnesses of Jesus.